Hey y'all, welcome. We're continuing our series going through Psalm 1, focused on its translation and its moral teachings. This is actually the third episode in the series, so if you want to start from the beginning, just go back 2 episodes and you'll get to hear the introduction to the Not a Bible translation of Psalm 1, which is my translation, and it is what we're going to be talking about in this whole series. We're still right at the beginning of the psalm. We've just covered one line, and we're going to be talking about the second line, which is still part of the first verse in this episode. But before diving in, let's recap a few of the main points from our previous episodes and also just some of the bigger picture of what this translation is all about. So the first main point is that we are looking at a new translation of Psalm 1 that's part of Not a Bible translation. The second point is that the principles by which Not a Bible translation operates are quite different from the principles that underlie Bible translations. So here are a few examples of what I mean. The first thing is the content. So any Bible translation is, kind of by definition, a translation of a particular collection of texts. So if you get a Protestant Bible, it is a translation of 66 specific books. So it's a closed, fixed collection of texts. Catholic Bible has slightly more books. A Greek Orthodox Bible has yet more, and so on and so forth. There are different Bibles, and a Bible translation is a translation of a collection. Not a Bible translation, on the other hand, isn't a translation of any particular collection. In fact, any ancient Israel-related writing could, in theory, be included within not a Bible translation. In other words, I may translate any ancient text that relates to ancient Israel, and I'll do it using these same principles that I'm translating all these other texts by. And so it will be part of Not a Bible translation, even though Not a Bible translation isn't a particular collection. So it can include more texts over time, and also it is really without respect to whether any particular writing was included in a biblical canon or not. So it will include texts that were included in biblical canons, such as Psalm 1, but it will also include texts that weren't included in any biblical canons, like the Thanksgiving hymns from the Dead Sea Scrolls, or certain ancient Israelite inscriptions. And I should also add here that I hope to eventually have a website with all the translations of Not a Bible translation, and rather than having it in a collection organized like a Bible canon, I hope to have them placed on a timeline, just put when they were likely written. And the reason for that is to encourage us to look at each text as an individual writing within its own historical context, rather than as part of a collection and it has some specific place in relation to other texts in the collection. Another implication of the fact that Not a Bible translation is not a Bible translation is that it is not putting forward the texts within it as some sort of definitive or authoritative collection of scripture for a particular community. That's what all Bible translations are. A Bible is a collection accepted by some community as the authoritative collection of scripture. Not a Bible translation is not that. I'm not making any claims regarding the texts that are within it as to whether they are authoritative or not authoritative. Instead, each writing is being placed before the reader as an individual text for their own investigation and study, etc., etc. And that is actually basically the next point that I wanted to mention. All the texts within Not a Bible translation are being treated as individual writings rather than as part of a collection. So it's not just about what texts are included in Not a Bible translation, it's about how we treat each individual text. And what does it really mean to treat a text as part of a Bible canon versus treating it as an individual text? Well, there are actually a lot of ways in which those two approaches to a text are quite different from each other. But I'll give one example that even relates to translation. When texts are translated as part of a Bible canon, there's a tendency to translate them in a way to make them speak with the same voice, to make them have the same perspective as the other texts within the collection. For a concrete example of this, there's a passage in Jeremiah, it's in chapter 7, verses 21 and 22, where Jeremiah says that Yahweh, the God of Israel, said, "When I brought you up from the land of Egypt, I did not command you regarding sacrifices and offerings." Now, many translations actually add a few words here. And so it reads something more like, "When I brought you up from the land of Egypt, I did not merely command you regarding sacrifices and offerings." So that merely part is something that is not at all in the text of Jeremiah. There's no basis for saying merely. It rather is a straightforward statement where Yahweh says, "When I brought you up from the land of Egypt, I did not command you regarding sacrifices and offerings." Now, to add the word merely radically changes the meaning. So why would someone add the word merely when there's no basis for it within the text? Well, the reason is that Jeremiah is being treated not as an individual text, but instead as part of a biblical canon. And so, since there are other texts within these biblical canons that very straightforwardly say that when Yahweh brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, he did command them regarding sacrifice and offering, the way that Jeremiah is translated is to harmonize it with those other texts. But again, it's really important to realize that when Jeremiah was put together with these other texts, when the biblical canon was being formed, was many, many centuries after the book of Jeremiah was written. So if we want to understand Jeremiah on its own terms, it's really important to read it within its own historical setting. And that's hard to do for readers of a translation if it's being translated in a way to harmonize it with texts that it was collected with centuries after it was written. And to show the kind of arbitrariness of this, in English Bibles, Jeremiah is never translated in a way that harmonizes it with the Book of Enoch, for example. And the reason why is that in English-speaking Christian and Jewish communities, the Book of Enoch is not part of the biblical canon. So why would you translate Jeremiah in a way to harmonize it with the Book of Enoch or some other text for that matter? But maybe in Ethiopia, I actually don't know, but in Ethiopia, both Ethiopian Jews and the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian Church have the Book of Enoch as part of their canon. And so maybe they do translate them in a way to harmonize. I don't know, but just saying in principle, you can see how the texts that you include within your biblical canon can make a difference as to how you even translate other texts. But again, all of these biblical canons are products of a much, much later date. So if we want to understand Jeremiah for Jeremiah's own sake, it's important to not translate it in a way that harmonizes it with other texts. That obscures its own distinctive teachings. So not a Bible translation treats each text as an individual text rather than trying to harmonize it with other texts because, again, it's not being placed in a collection with other texts. So the next big point to keep in mind is that the translation itself of not a Bible translation departs from the already established tradition of English Bible translations. Unlike most Bible translations, not a Bible translation is not a revision of previous translation work. So if you listen to the 2 previous episodes, you'll probably remember me talking about the tradition of English Bible translation and how the vast majority of English Bibles are following that tradition and either being direct revisions, like the vast majority are actually direct revisions of previous translations. But even those that are not direct revisions are very influenced by them and follow their wording to a significant degree. Not a Bible translation simply does not do that. It's not being produced by means of revising previous translation work. Uh, if it so happens that the best way to translate something matches what other translations have done, that's fine. It's not like I'm approaching it with a preference to find something different, but I'm also not approaching it with a preference of doing something the same. I'm merely seeking to find what words, phrases, grammatical forms, etc., most accurately and fully reflect the Hebrew text. And remember how this is really important to do for so many reasons, one of which is that the English language itself has changed, and there are many more options of English words and phrases that we can use today that weren't even available to people a couple hundred years ago. And that's just one example among many others as to why it's important to not be too tied to previous translation work. Another difference between not a Bible translation and other translations is that it aims at achieving a far higher rate of consistency than is found in most translations. So many translations, rather than taking a given word or phrase and translating it the same way across its instances, it's very, very common for the same phrase or word to be translated in a great variety of ways. But not a Bible translation seeks to translate far more consistently. And of course, there are nuances of that that I covered in the last episode if you want to hear the details. But what a very consistent method of translating serves to do is that it maintains distinctions between words with similar yet distinct meanings. And it also preserves connections between words that share the same root. And thus, it actually makes the nuances of what the original authors were trying to communicate more apparent. So the last difference that I'll mention between not a Bible translation and other translations is that the English into which not a Bible translation translates is not standardized English. So standardized English is the type of English that you learn in school. But most people actually speak differently than the sort of English that you learn in school. And English has many varieties that are very different in some ways from that standardized English. So instead of limiting the English that I'm using in not a Bible translation to standardized forms and vocabulary, I'm actually using any feature or word or form of any variety of English that accurately reflects the original. So if it's standardized, that's fine. But if it's not standardized, that's also fine. I'm just not limiting the English into which I translate. So long as the English is understandable, then hey, I'm embracing it and utilizing it so long as it is the best option that I can find to, again, most fully and accurately reflect the Hebrew original. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention, just to remember from previous episodes, is that the text known as Psalm 1 was originally not called Psalm 1. I'm calling it Psalm 1 some of the time in our discussion and in the titles of the podcast episodes here, just so it's easy for people to find if they're looking up something related to this text. But really, when this text was written, it had not yet been collected with other psalms and given a number. So its more official title within Not a Bible Translation is Cheers for the Man, since that's how it begins. And texts in the ancient Near East were often known by their opening words. You may remember in the last episode that I mentioned that the translation of Psalm 1, Cheers for the Man, that I have produced for Not a Bible Translation is the best way I currently know how to reflect the Hebrew original, but that I may update it in the future for several reasons. Well, the day for the first update has arrived. And of course, I'll read it to you here. But before I do, I want to mention a few things to kind of help you to not view the translation in a particular way that you might be inclined to view it as without this preparation. You'll notice when I read it that the translation departs even further from standardized English as compared to the earlier version of this same phrase that has now been updated. So because it's a bit further removed from standardized English, it might come across to at least some people as intentionally attempting to achieve a certain style in English or to be relatable to a particular community. And there are certain Bible paraphrases that actually do that, like the Message Bible, for example. And there's another Bible less well known called the Street Bible. And both of these use more colloquial forms some of the time, really for the purpose of appealing to a certain audience and achieving a certain style in English. Those paraphrases really were not produced just trying to most accurately convey the Hebrew, and then were kind of forced to non-standard forms by that goal. So as an example, here in the very first verse of Psalm 1, the Message Bible talks about people who are blind as bats. And the Street Bible actually mentions FM radio. Now, neither of those have any basis in the actual Hebrew text of Psalm 1. So I mentioned this to say that what those paraphrases are doing and what I'm doing with Not a Bible Translation are two very, very different things, even though both end up using a bit more colloquial language and forms that are not necessarily considered correct within standardized English. The way that we get there is very, very different. As I've been explaining in these episodes, the methods that I'm using to produce the English translation that is Not a Bible Translation are very thorough and are specifically designed to reflect the Hebrew as accurately as possible. So just remember, when I use a non-standard form, it's not like I'm trying to go for a certain effect in English. It's just that I didn't cancel out that form from the get-go, and it happened to be the best one I could find to accurately reflect the Hebrew. Okay, so now to the specifics of the change that I made, the update that I made in Not a Bible Translation. So when I read Psalm 1 a couple episodes back, the first verse sounded like this. Cheers for the man who not gone in the counsel of wrongdoers, and in the way of errorists not stayed, and in the residence of talkers not resided. Okay, so there's an aspect of this that might sound odd from the perspective of standardized English, and that is that there seems to be a missing word before the word not. So, cheers for the man who not gone. How about who has not gone, or who is not gone, who had not gone? There are various words that we might insert there. So why is it that that word was missing? Well, the reason is that including that word, whether you have had or has or is, any of those variations, including those words actually add some connotation to the passage that isn't there in the Hebrew. And so I knew I had to avoid giving that connotation. So if you say, cheers for the man who has not gone in the council of wrongdoers, that uses the present perfect form in English, and it conveys the idea that the person in their past did not go in the way of wrongdoers. And that somehow, the fact that they didn't go in the way of wrongdoers is relevant for the present. That's what that would convey. And of course, if you say had not gone, well, that's the past perfect form, and it conveys a slightly different nuance if you say is not gone. But in any case, whichever word you insert there, in English, those words are primarily designed to identify tense. But the fact is that the Hebrew verb here is not actually specifically encoding tense. So we're adding these tense connotations, and it actually ends up giving an incorrect understanding of the poem that I'll talk about in more detail later in this very episode. So the translation that I had, cheers for the man who not gone, avoids that particular misunderstanding being overt in the English translation. So that's good. Yeah, it avoids something that needs to be avoided, but it actually ends up leaving unspecified something that's in the Hebrew text that I now know to be specified, and now I know how to convey that specification within English. But doing so requires using non-standard forms. So I'll read now the updated Not a Bible translation of Psalm 1:1, and then we'll talk about the various nuances and what this means, and we'll talk about it both in terms of the English and the Hebrew. Cheers for the man who ain't done gone in the council of wrongdoers, and in the way of errorists ain't done stayed, and in the residence of talkers ain't done resided. All right, specifically, we're going to be focused on the phrase ain't done gone in the council of wrongdoers. In the last episode, we talked about cheers for the man who, that's the very first line. In this episode, we're talking about the second line, ain't done gone in the council of wrongdoers. And in future episodes, we'll talk about the rest. And as will become apparent, we're going to have to talk about grammar. And so if you are a word nerd, you'll probably just love this. And if you're not a word nerd, I think you may end up loving it anyway, because as we'll see, the difference in grammar, the different nuances that are being conveyed, actually have a significant impact on how we understand the moral teachings of the poem. So this isn't just getting into technicalities of language for some trivial purpose. This really does have practical implications. Okay, so let's start with the word done. Cheers for the man who ain't done gone. Okay, what is this done? Well, if you happen to be a speaker of Southern American English or of African American English, it probably is no mystery to you. This particular done is a grammatical feature used in those dialects, and it's actually used in other dialects of English beyond that as well. And linguists have different names for this particular done. It's sometimes called the perfective done, or the completive done, or the preverbal done. And the reason why it's called a preverbal done is that it comes immediately before a verb. So this is different from the done used in the sentence, I'll be done with the drill in a minute. Notice how there, the done does not immediately precede a verb. But if you say, I done walked, well, that's different. That's the done we're talking about, the done that comes just before a verb. And the way that this done relates to the verb is kind of similar to how the word have relates to a verb in a sentence, I have walked. Now, I said it's similar, but it's important to know that it's not the same. It's not that have and done do the same thing to the word walked in that case, but both of them relate to the word walked in a similar way. And as these things tend to go, linguists actually debate the precise nuances of the meaning of this done. But it's generally agreed that its meaning and uses include both perfective and perfect connotations. Now, if you're not familiar with perfective and perfect in grammar, no worries. That's part of why we're here. We're going to explain those very ideas. But before I do, I just want to put a little footnote here or a little qualification just saying that linguists even have different theories as to the precise meaning of the notions perfective and perfect. But for our purposes, there really is no need to get into that. I'll explain exactly how I'm using the terms, and I'll describe the notions insofar as it's relevant for the task at hand. And then if you're really interested in nerding out on perfective and imperfective and perfect and the differences between all of those, you can just go read the works of linguists. Okay, so perfective. What does it mean for a verb to be perfective? Well, speakers of mainstream varieties of English tend to think of verbs in terms of tense. Now, tense has to do with relating events to other events in time. So you can kind of imagine a timeline, and when you're using tense, you're trying to identify whether one event is before or after or contemporaneous with another event. And very often in English, when we use tense, the default time to which we are comparing everything else is the present moment, the moment in which we are speaking. But not all verbal systems and verbal forms in all languages function to indicate tense. Tense is just one way that verbs can operate. But there's something else called aspect that is another way that verbs can operate. Some verbs and some verbal systems encode aspect rather than tense. And aspect is not about relating events to other events in time. Instead, aspect is about how an event's temporal characteristics are being described. So let's say you have one event, and aspect can describe that one event in terms of its own temporal characteristics, or at least how one talks about its temporal characteristics. There are two main types of aspect, perfective and imperfective. Perfective aspect conceptualizes an event as a whole, a single temporal unit, without paying attention to its internal dynamics. Imperfective aspect, on the other hand, conceptualizes an event as a dynamic process. Okay, so even though I know I'm trying to convey this very clearly, I know that if these are new ideas, it can be kind of hard to wrap our minds around. So I'm going to just quickly recap that same thing. So tense relates actions to each other in time. Is a certain event before or after or at the same time as another event. Whereas aspect is saying, okay, let's take a single event. How are we going to describe the temporal characteristics of that event? I could view the event as a whole, as a single unit without paying attention to its changes within the event, and that's perfective aspect. Or I could talk about the event as a changing process. That is imperfective aspect. Now, it's important to realize that if you have a particular verbal form that encodes aspect or encodes tense, that doesn't mean that the person using that form is incapable of thinking of the other idea as well. So, for example, if I say, I ate, well, that in English is encoding past tense, right? That's what the actual form ate is doing. It is encoding past tense. However, I may also be thinking of that event as just a unit, not paying attention to its internal characteristics. It's just that that isn't what is being encoded in my language. And because tense and aspect are quite different things, you could actually refer to an event that happened in the past using a tense that encodes past tense, and you could be thinking of it as perfective, or you could be thinking of it as imperfective. Likewise, you can refer to a future event using a verb that encodes future tense and be thinking of it as either perfective or imperfective. This is just to say that perfective and imperfective do not inherently tie to any particular tense. And the same is true when you start with aspect. You could use verbs that encode perfective aspect and do so in a context in which you're referring to the past or the present or the future. And the same goes for imperfective aspect. Now, standardized English actually does not have forms that specifically encode aspect, but some non-standard varieties of English do, like Southern American English and African American English, with this perfective done. Notice it is perfective. So if I say, I done ate, I'm specifically encoding that the action of eating is being viewed as a whole. I'm not paying attention to its internal changes. I'm just viewing it as this one unitary whole event. And interestingly, in African American English, there's actually an imperfective aspect. It's known as the habitual be. So if you say Cookie Monster be eating cookies, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's eating cookies right now. It just means that he does so regularly or habitually. And it turns out that Hebrew also has aspect encoded into some of its verbs. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, let's talk about perfect. What does it mean for a verb to be perfect? Perfect is a linguistic concept that has to do with the relevance of an earlier action for a later moment. And mainstream varieties of English actually do have perfect constructions, like the present perfect and the past perfect. So present perfect, I have walked. Past perfect, I had walked. So again, these forms are describing past events that are relevant for an event that is future from that past event. And specifically, the present perfect in English is actually something that describes a past action's relevance for the present moment. So you could ask me, are you hungry? And I could say, I've eaten, which is just the contracted form of I have eaten. What this form does is it says that I ate in the past and that is relevant for the present. So I'm basically answering your question by explaining why I'm not hungry right now. I have eaten. Now, interestingly, in African American English, the preverbal done can be used in basically all the places where speakers of more mainstream varieties of English would use the preverbal have. So that basically shows that the preverbal done can be used to indicate perfect connotations. Yet, there are places where speakers of African American English use the word done, this preverbal done, in contexts in which speakers of mainstream varieties of English cannot use the word have, had, or has. So the preverbal done is similar in some of its uses to the perfect in mainstream varieties of English, but it's not exactly the same. In those other cases, it still retains its perfective meaning. As a side note, I just want to say that I've been using terms like speakers of African American English, speakers of mainstream English. It's just worth knowing that those aren't mutually exclusive categories. Someone could speak both varieties, Just like you can have someone speak multiple languages, and thus they fit in the category of, say, speakers of English and speakers of French, or whatever the languages happen to be. Okay, so now let's go to the Hebrew. We're going to be talking about a conjugation of Hebrew verbs known as Qatal. Now, Qatal is one of the most commonly used conjugations in Hebrew. And the verb that I'm translating gone here in the first verse of Cheers for the Man is in the Qatal conjugation. So, what does Qatal mean? And what's the best way to translate it into English? If you look through how most English Bibles translate Qatal forms, you'll find that in many places it's translated as a simple past tense verb, and in other places it's translated as a present perfect or a past perfect. So you might find, so and so ate. Well, that's just the simple past tense form. Or so and so has eaten, or so and so had eaten. You'll find all those translations of the Qatal form. Yet, scholars of ancient Hebrew generally agree that Qatal has perfective meaning, which of course is absent from those forms that I just mentioned. Now, it's really interesting that when you look at the scholarly discussion over the meaning of Qatal, and then you look at the very separate scholarly discussion over the meaning of the preverbal done in these varieties of English, those two discussions are surprisingly similar. I just find that really interesting. For example, in both cases, some scholars think that the perfect connotation is primary, while the perfective is secondary, or that the perfective is somehow included within the perfect, while other scholars think that the perfective connotation is primary, and that the perfect is secondary or subsumed within the perfective. In both cases, there are scholars who see historical development where one connotation develops into the other. And regardless of how it works out with the details of how you define perfective and perfect and what you view as primary or secondary or whatever, still, generally speaking, most scholars would agree, both for the Qatal and for the preverbal done, that both the perfective and perfect connotations are relevant for the verbal form. Now, that alone makes the preverbal done a good option for translating Qatal, since again, the other options within English don't even have the perfective aspect. And really, in considering this subject quite thoroughly, I'm not aware of any other form in English that has this much similarity in meaning to the Qatal. Perfectivity is at least an important aspect, if not the fundamental aspect of Qatal. And when I say aspect here, I just mean feature, not talking about aspect versus tense. So again, standardized English does not have perfective forms. For that, we have to go to non-standardized Englishes, where we find the perfective done. So really, just the similarity of meaning of the preverbal done or the perfective done and the Qatal form is a good reason to think, well, maybe we should actually translate the Qatal using preverbal done. But then there's also the pragmatic consideration of when you go through instances of Qatal in Hebrew and are looking for the best way to translate it into English, what actually works? And of course, since people are using the simple past tense and present perfect and past perfect to translate Qatal, I mean, obviously that's kind of getting by, at least to some extent, but there are actually major exceptions to this. In poetry, it's quite common for people to translate Qatal in present tense. Well, why is that? Why would one have to do that if Qatal is fundamentally a past tense verb or even a perfect? why would it need to be translated in present in all these cases? But here's the thing. So far as I've been able to determine, all the cases in which Qatal is translated as a simple past or as a perfect form, all of those cases could be translated as a perfective aspect using the perfective preverbal done. In other words, that works in all the cases where the simple past works and in all the cases where the perfect forms work. And it even does a better job at conveying the meaning since it communicates the perfective aspect, like the Qatal form does. But even beyond that, there are cases where neither the simple past tense form or the perfect form work for translating Qatal, but where the preverbal done does work. So I'll give you a couple categories of instances in which this is the case. The first is called performative Qatal. A performative expression is one in which the action of the verb takes place by means of pronouncing the expression. So classic examples include vows, like I now pronounce you man and wife, or oaths, I swear, etc., or the oral transfer of ownership, I give you whatever. All of those are examples of performative speech. Again, it's not that someone's putting on a show, it's that someone is actually accomplishing the act of the verb by means of uttering the expression. And you may have noticed that all the examples that I just gave are present tense. That's because in mainstream varieties of English, we use present tense for performative speech. In ancient Hebrew, performative speech was accomplished by Qatal. Now, this wouldn't make sense if Qatal, in its very essence, was a simple past tense verb, or if it was a perfect verb in its fundamental essence. And the reason why is that both of those deal with past tense, whereas performative speech is inherently tied to the present moment. It refers to an action that's being accomplished in the moment of speaking. Now, because of this scenario, when English translators come across Qatal verbs that are being used for performative speech, they actually don't translate it as a past tense verb or as a perfect verb. Instead, they translate it in the simple present tense. So that really shows how past tense and perfect tense translations are inadequate representations of Qatal. If we're viewing this as a test, the past tense and the perfect just aren't passing when it comes to the performative Qatal. But the preverbal done actually does work because it is used in expressions like I done swear or I done give. So it's used in performative speech. So whether we're talking about the preverbal done or Qatal, using perfective aspect to communicate performative speech actually makes sense. So remember, the perfective aspect is viewing the event as a whole rather than paying attention to internal changes. So if I say, I give you this hat, well, it makes sense to view that as a whole because if I viewed it as something that was changing over time, then it might seem like I'm merely in the process of giving you this hat. So you're kind of left wondering, well, is it mine? Is it not mine? But if it's perfective, then saying, I done give you this hat makes it clear that the act of giving is complete. So when it comes to performative speech, preverbal done succeeds in reflecting the meaning of Qatal when the alternatives do not. Saying I gave, the simple past, is not performative speech. I have given, I had given, those are the perfect forms. They do not convey performative speech. Saying I done give can be used in performative speech, and it is perfective. Okay, another category of instances of Qatal where past and perfect forms do not work But where the perfective preverbal done does work is stative verbs. Stative verbs are a class of verbs that refer to actions where the action stays within the actor, like hope or know or think. All of those sorts of verbs don't go out. Like if I say, I kicked the ball, well, the action goes out of the actor to something else. If I think, well, the action just stays within the actor. And in ancient Hebrew, there are plenty of times where Qatal is used for stative verbs where it refers to the present, not to the past. So, for example, yada in Hebrew is the third person masculine singular Qatal form of the verb to know. And if Qatal was a past tense verb form or a perfect verb form, then you would think that it would mean something like he knew, or he has known, or he had known. But actually, it simply means to know in the present. He knows. Just for an example, you can find this in Genesis 31, verse 6, but there are many, many other examples. So clearly, the past and the perfect in English do not work here as translations of the Qatal for stative verbs. But the perfective preverbal done does work because you can say, I done know, or I done think, or I done hope, or whatever. You can use those expressions with the preverbal done. So this is just another case in which the preverbal done actually matches the meaning and use of Qatal much better than the alternatives. So all considered, preverbal done is the closest match that I'm aware of to Qatal. So unless and until evidence and argument favor another form, then that's what I'm planning to use to translate Qatal. And that's why here in Psalm 1, Cheers for the Man, I translate it as ain't done gone, ain't done stayed, ain't done resided. Before going on, this is a great opportunity for a lesson about language bias. Very often, people who speak mainstream varieties of English tend to have negative evaluations of non-mainstream varieties of English, viewing them as maybe inferior, improper, unsophisticated, inaccurate, ungrammatical, etc. And it's not even that people are necessarily overtly trying to do this. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are overt in their negative views of these sorts of English, but it's also the case that just, hey, when we go to school, we're taught that have sent is correct, but something like done sent is incorrect. But the reality of things is that that isn't an evaluation based on understanding sound principles of language. It's really just a social bias in favor of one variety of English over another. And really, the way that standardized English became what it is, became standardized, is that those who spoke that variety, or really its predecessor, since this happened a while ago and even standardized English has changed, those people gained power in society and ended up asserting that their dialect, their manner of speaking English, is the correct and proper one, while all the others are aberrations. And it is even more complicated than that because there are so-called rules that are there in standardized English that really no one has ever followed, like not ending a sentence in a preposition. That's always been part of how people talk, and it only ever became a so-called rule in grammar because that's the way Latin works, and people thought that English should be like Latin. But again, it's just never actually described how English really works. But when you approach these varieties of English with a straightforward, unbiased perspective of just language principles, how does language actually work cross-linguistically? no variety of English is inherently superior over any other variety. I mean, sure, there are some features that one variety might have that others don't, and those might be very cool and useful features. But that other variety may have features that the first one didn't. And so, it's just languages are different and they can all accomplish a lot of the same things using different means. And some of them accomplish different things using their own means that aren't quite available in some other variety. And what we've seen here in looking at Psalm 1, Cheers for the Man, is that non-standard varieties of English actually have some features that more accurately and fully reflect the ancient Hebrew text as compared to what we can find in mainstream varieties of English. So that lets us know that these other varieties may have lots of value even for people who aren't native speakers of them. And of course, we are talking about the Psalms here, and the Psalms are generally recognized as quite high quality literature. So we really shouldn't have this negative stigma, and that's kind of the take home message for speakers of mainstream varieties of English. Don't look down on non-standard varieties. They are just as legit in their own right, and they have some good qualities that standardized English lacks. And some of those qualities are even very good for translating ancient Hebrew. Also, for those of you who speak non-standard varieties of English, I hope that this helps you to realize, if you haven't already, that your variety is a perfectly legitimate way of speaking. It has its own internal consistencies. It's just as grammatical as other varieties of English, and there is real value in your variety. And if you happen to speak a variety of English that uses the preverbal done, you actually have the privilege of more intuitively understanding the nuances of ancient Hebrew Qatal forms, at least when they're translated using the preverbal done, which, unfortunately, mostly isn't the case, but with a not a Bible translation, it is. So hopefully you enjoy that and get a lot out of it and, can really intuitively understand the meaning. Okay, so let's go on to the next part, the word ain't. So why ain't? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. Ain't is the way to negate the preverbal done in present contexts. And this leads to considering the time to which the poem refers. It is actually referring to a general present context, even though the verbal forms are not encoding present tense. So remember what I said before about how you can use perfective aspect or imperfective aspect when you're talking about the past or when you're talking about the present or when you're talking about the future? Yeah, so we are actually within a general present context here, but the verbal form qatal is not itself expressing that. But let's just briefly go through a couple things that show that we are talking about a present tense context. So I'll read the first couple of verses and point out something. Cheers for the man who ain't done gone in the counsel of wrongdoers, and in the way of errorists ain't done stayed, and in the residence of talkers ain't done resided, but only in the direction of he who does his thing, his delight, and in his direction he patters by day and night. Okay, the verb translated patters in the last line there is a conjugation known as yiktol. So this is something different than qatal. But yiktol expresses a range of modal connotations, which we'll talk about more in a future episode. And in this case, it's being used to refer to habitual action. It's saying that this person regularly or normally patters in the direction of he who does this thing. And again, we'll come back to that later. What does it mean to patter, etc., etc.? So in standardized English, it is common to use the simple present tense form to refer to habitual behavior. For example, if I say she works out, that's different from saying she is working out, precisely in that saying she is working out refers to an action she's doing contemporaneously with the moment of speech, while saying she works out doesn't necessarily mean she's doing it right now. It just means that it's something that she does regularly. So the point here is that the psalm is portraying this person, this man for whom it is giving cheers, as someone who patters in the direction of he who does this thing by day and night. So it's something that's regularly done. So it's a general present tense expression. Now, the first part, cheers for the man who ain't done gone and who ain't done this and who ain't done that, that's an expression of what the person avoids. Whereas the next part, he patters in the direction of he who does this thing, is an expression of what he does. And the way that these two parts are linked is by an expression that I'm translating as but only. And what it is like a direct contrast. It's saying he doesn't do this, but only this. He doesn't do ABC, but only X. And making that direct comparison only makes sense when the things being avoided and the things being engaged in co-occur with each other. So, for example, it would not make sense to say, I haven't lived in Spain. On the contrary, I live in Germany. That wouldn't make sense because there's nothing contradictory about having formerly lived in Spain and then moving to Germany. But it actually does make sense to say, I don't live in Spain. On the contrary, I live in Germany. Because you can't do both at the same time. So in other words, since the psalm directly contrasts what the person doesn't do with what the person does do, it is portraying both states as co-occurring. And since it's clear that what they do actually do is in the general present, that indicates that what they avoid is also being portrayed as part of the general present. And if we continue on, there's something else that confirms this and brings out another nuance. Okay, so this is going on to verse 3. And he does his thing as a tree transplanted upon streams of waters, who puts forth his fruit in his time, and his upgrowth doesn't wither, and all that he works, he advances. Okay, so that is, again, using mostly Qatal forms to describe the regular activity of the person in the general present. But even more significantly for the present point is the fact that the word here translated transplanted really does mean something like transplanted. It's not the normal word for planting something. It is the word for transplanting something. Okay, so the person that is given these cheers and who avoids these various forms of wrongdoing and instead engages in right doing is being described as a tree that has been transplanted upon the streams of waters. As we'll cover in the future, the streams of waters here are used as a metaphor for the direction or instruction of he who does his thing, that is Yahweh, the God of Israel. And by saying that he was transplanted there, it is quite directly implying that he had formerly not been there. He had a former state, a former life, not being nourished upon the streams of waters. And since the streams of waters are the source from which someone learns the way of righteousness within the psalm, it's implying that the person formerly had a life not living according to the ways of righteousness. So what that shows is that if we interpret the first verse of the psalm to be saying, oh, cheers for the man who has not gone in the way of wrongdoers, we would actually be misinterpreting it. The intention of the author is not to say that the person has a clean past record. Instead, they're just trying to say that they ain't done gone in the council of wrongdoers. In other words, they're portraying going in the council of wrongdoers in a perfective aspect and saying that the person ain't done that. And to be a bit more clear on that, what would it mean to say the person done gone in the council of wrongdoers? Well, that would be viewing their act of going in the council of wrongdoers as a unitary whole, as an unchanging event, not as a dynamic process. Now, that's what it's explicitly denying. It's explicitly denying that the person engaged in the action of going in the way of wrongdoers in a complete sense, as an unchanging, non dynamic act, which would imply that they went there and stayed there. It doesn't deny that the person ever engaged in wrongdoing. So that's quite a difference. And what this means on a practical level is that really there's nothing in the psalm that would warrant someone reading it and thinking, oh man, I can look at my past and I went in the council of wrongdoers. Therefore, the cheers here can never be for me. No, there's no way to warrant that because it's not denying wrong in the past. It's denying that someone went there and stayed there non-dynamically without changing to leave the way of wrongdoers. So the man may have gone in the council of wrongdoers, but left it. The person may have gone in the way of errorists, but left it, etc., etc. Okay, so let's move on to the next word. It's the word gone. So cheers for the man who ain't done gone. This word in Hebrew is halach, and people usually say it means walk. But really, the verb doesn't have anything to say about the method of motion. It's not about legs moving or anything like that. And the way that we know this is because it's used to refer to rivers going through countries, snakes going on their bellies, boats going on water, and it's even used in expressions like, I'm going to die. And I have examples of all of those cases in the blog post if you want to check it out. So when you look across all the instances of this word, it's clear that it's a very general word meaning to go. So the expression gone in the council of wrongdoers is a metaphor for one conforming one's actions to that counsel, to obey that counsel. It's a similar metaphor to the common English expression to follow advice. So cheers for the man who ain't done gone in the council of wrongdoers, who hasn't conformed their actions to that counsel. All right, so this has actually been quite a long podcast already. So I'm going to actually stop here. There's more to the verse, but I'm going to cover that in a separate episode. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. And if you did, and if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, I hope you will subscribe, and then we'll talk sometime soon. All right. Thanks for joining me. Talk to you next time.